Hi, I'm Sarah Brzezinski. Welcome to the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory's Next Generation Student Interview Series. Today, I'll be speaking with Christina, who is a former master's student and a current PhD student. Christina, hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's nice to catch up. So
Yes.
Christina, tell us a bit about yourself. Where are you from?
So I was born actually in Pennsylvania, but grew up in Indiana and California, and then spent some time in Massachusetts for my undergrad, and then made my way to Maryland for graduate school.
How old were you when you went to the Arctic for the first time?
So I was 14 when I went to the Arctic for the first time. It was right before my freshman year of high school. Um, and I was involved in middle school in a program called People to People, which is a US program that was started by President Eisenhower in the 50s with this idea to promote peace through understanding. So if the younger generation kind of learned from each other and traveled to these places, that maybe we wouldn't grow up with some of the same biases previous generations had grown up with. And they had partnered with this Canadian organization and program called Students on Ice, who take students to the Arctic and the Antarctic. Um, and so I actually traveled with that program as an alum of People to People, and went to Iceland, Greenland, and Canada, Baffin Island in Canada. So I actually started on the Atlantic side of the Arctic. I now currently work on the Pacific side of the Arctic. But that's kind of how I found Students on Ice and stumbled into this.
That's amazing. That sounds like a really transformative experience for a young student. And what drew you to the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory for your master's degree initially?
Originally, it was actually working for my advisors, Dr. Jackie Grubmeyer, and then my committee member, Dr. Lee Cooper.
So, Christina, what does a typical day look like for you? I imagine that there's a pretty wide diversity in terms of what days look like, whether you're on a research vessel in the Bering or the Chukchi Sea or at the lab. But what sort of things could you describe for us to give us an idea of that?
Yeah, so as you just alluded to, I kind of maybe have a couple of typical days. So generally in the summer, July and August months, I am on a research vessel in the Arctic, collecting samples. And so a typical day out at sea looks like the most untypical day you can think of. We work when we're on station, so the station is where we're collecting the information that we're interested in. And when we're on station, we're working. So it looks like being awake at 2 a.m. or being awake at 1 p.m. or starting work at 7 a.m. and ending at 8 p.m. Sometimes the days feel a little bit more normal. You nap at odd hours, you nap for odd amounts of time. But a station kind of you send over the equipment in a particular order, and the groups that are responsible for those take their samples, and then the next group kind of goes. Our group, we touch almost every piece of equipment that goes in the water. So we're looking at things in the water column, we're looking at sediment characteristics on the bottom, we're looking at animals on the bottom, I'm looking at clams on the bottom. And so a typical day at sea kind of just looks like a hodgepodge of non-normal functioning. um, and so, but it's really fun, right? That's the part that I really fell in love with, being outside, touching the science, experiencing the wind, seeing the whales like breach off the side of the boat every once in a while, seeing the walruses, playing in the dirt and mud and seeing what's living down there.
What about when you get back to the lab?
Yeah, so a typical day in the lab for me, I usually spend what we call sorting the samples. So we take all these samples from the bottom. As I've mentioned, I'm particularly interested in clams, but my advisor is looking at the community composition. So who's living there? How many of them are there? What is their biomass? So the weight of the availability there. And so we sort. So we have these samples that we've taken, and we've rinsed away all the mud. So in theory, the only things that are left are, shells and living animals and maybe some rocks and pebbles. But we've gotten rid of most of the sediment. And then myself and a handful of other people, sort through and pick out everything that was once living. So these samples are preserved at sea. So we take anything that was alive at the time of collection, and we ID it. So most of the faculty research assistants in our lab are much better at that than I am. They have a lot more training in it, so they can take it down to species. I usually can get to genus in some species, and so IDing what's there. And so I spend 6 to 8 hours looking in a microscope and IDing animals. These samples, they can be time consuming from start to finish. Can take anywhere from 5 to 15 hours per sample. And we're taking 4 samples at each site, and we do about 40 sites on every cruise roughly. So we come back with a lot of data, but it takes a lot of time to get through.
So Christina, what about for a kid who's interested in a science, technology, engineering, or math career? What advice would you give to a child?
Go for it. I I was really blessed as a kid. I grew up, I kind of have that stereotypical story of growing up with a relative or like walking along the beach. But my aunt runs her own education program, and so I got exposed to it really young. But, just like I told prospective graduate students to pester potential advisors, pester your parents. I mean, I'm sure every parent is now cringing as I say that, but, I asked and I kept asking, and my parents helped encourage that. And if you see something that you're excited about, like, ask about it. I was a really shy and timid kid, except with my parents. And as an adult, people don't believe that. They're like, you can talk to a brick wall. What do you mean you were shy and timid? And so looking back, I kind of wish 7-year-old Christina was as like crazy as this. But the same kind of thing, if you hear about something in school, but try and look outside of school. I know, the younger kids are probably relying more on their parents, but drag them to things like Oyster Fest, drag them to things like, the Bernie Fowler weigh-in. And older kids hopefully will foster that with younger kids as well. If you're a younger kid, reach out to an older kid. And so I got involved in people to people and students on ice by getting invitations in the mail or hearing about it and asking questions. And they're expensive. I fundraised money. I had to fundraise. It was a lot of work, but it's kind of ambiguous advice. But I think just don't be afraid to ask, and don't be afraid to reach out or get an adult to take you somewhere.
That's great advice. So Christina, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It was great catching up.
Absolutely, this was wonderful, and I hope I hope it was helpful. And I really enjoy talking about this stuff. So this has been lovely.
Well, you have a real passion for it, and it's great to be able to see you get to pursue that passion. So thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone for joining us.